Ambassador Ertharin Cousin, welcome to GZERO World.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to talk about this very important subject.
Now, you have said that this is now a perfect storm in terms of global food insecurity. Why don't we open up with you just explaining a little bit of what you mean by that?
We're seeing that now with the both wheat and corn prices doubling and continuing to escalate. We also another indicator was high fuel prices. I need not tell your audience about the challenges of high fuel prices, and everyone who's going to the pump recognizes how high our fuel prices are now. But that has a direct impact on the cost of food because of transport costs and when there is an escalation in fuel. We are now seeing, as fuel prices increases in the production of biofuels. And finally, the fertilizer challenge. The fertilizer challenge began even before the start of this year, where the International Fertilizer Association was suggesting that there would approximately a 30% reduction in the amount of fertilizer that was available in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, and that 30% could and result in affecting of course it does result in affecting the yields and could affect the access to food for about 100 million people. All of those factors came online even before the Russian invasion into Ukraine. And so, with all of those factors online and the Russian invasion, that's the perfect storm. We know that approximately 30% of all the global wheat that is produced is produced in Russia and Ukraine combined. We know that over 75% of the essential oils, particularly sunflower oil,
Yeah.
is produced in those countries. And many would argue that loss in production and distribution and transport of those commodities should only affect or would only affect those who import directly from Ukraine and Russia. But in reality, yes, it does affect those countries, but because of less availability on the market of stocks, it affects the entire global community because it raises the prices.
Yeah, those countries we're talking mostly Eastern Europe, North Africa, direct imports from Russia and Ukraine of largest scale. But these are global markets. So, I mean, the prices are going up. Prices are going up for everyone. If supply chain's a problem, it's a problem for everyone.
Exactly. And that is exactly what we're witnessing. And the challenge is that agriculture is a seasonal business. And so we are seeing this with the spring wheat. And now we know that the Ukrainians are not in the field planting. And so we have the challenge of summer and winter wheats now. And so that means that we're not talking about a short-term problem here. This is a much longer-term potential food challenge.
I know prices went up on food and on energy around the world, in part because of supply chain challenges with pandemic, and suddenly demand just explodes and you don't have ships in place. There's massive fiscal stimulus. But what was behind the sudden lack of availability in fertilizers?
Well, the component parts of fertilizer also include gas. All of those component parts and the availability of those component parts affected the production and resulted in higher costs as well as less availability of fertilizer.
Now I want to turn to Russia, largest grain producer in the world. So much of the conversation in the United States is we got to cut off their oil, we got to cut off their gas, we got to cut off their coal, we can't give them that money. I don't see anybody saying we got to cut off their food because we need their food. I don't mean the Americans, but poor people all over the world who are relying on food production. What do you do when the country that's engaged in the war crimes is also absolutely essential to the supply chain for the poor people's food on the planet?
Well, indeed, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the Director General, has asked for an exemption for Russian commodities from the sanction, with that exact thought process in mind, that they have such a significant effect on the availability of food for hungry people around the world, that that should be recognized by the global community, and we should allow those commodities into the global food chain. But here's the question that we as a community of global actors must ask. Yes, we need the food, but should the Russian government benefit from the purchase of that food?
And how would you stop that, since they're the ones that are responsible for allowing or not allowing the export?
That's the challenge. That's the challenge. It's that true conundrum of, should I allow the most vulnerable, particularly because that's who's affected with high food prices. Should I allow them to go hungry because I don't want to financially benefit the Russian government? And that's the question that leaders of the Security Council must make in making that final determination about the access to Russian food. Because here's the reality: if the Security Council says no, the non-aligned countries whose support you need to ensure the continuance of a global order that prohibits this type of behavior, you can't ask for their support for a political issue when their people are starving.
And you certainly can't do it when the Europeans are much wealthier and they're actually paying the Russians to get their energy.
That is as they say, the elephant in the room. How do you say that it's okay to exempt the gas for Europe, but not the food for the global South?
Whether we're talking about the pandemic, or whether we're talking about climate change, and now we're talking about food, these global crises, and we kind of know who's taking it on the chin. It's the poorest countries in the world, and countries that through 50 years of globalization had hoped that they were going to be doing better over time, now feels like it's crisis after crisis after crisis. How is the United States, how are the wealthy countries going to maintain any level of trust and alignment with these poorer developing countries through the kind of crisis that we are talking about right now?
Well, that's a really thorny but vitally important question. The reality of it is, the countries in the global South are watching the decisions that are made to allow Russia to continue to sell oil and gas into Europe so that their prices don't go up and that they have access to the gas that they need. While at the same time, we are suggesting that they sacrifice their access to food when we do not allow for an exemption from the sanctions for Russia to sell food to those countries, when their people cannot afford the higher price food. And many of these countries are continuing to reel financially from the investments that they made in supporting their people during COVID. So their debt levels are quite high, their finances are quite low, and now they cannot subsidize and support the cost of food. And so it becomes critically important that we move beyond platitudes in how we respond to, address, and discuss with the countries of the global South, and begin to make the financial investments that are necessary that will allow these countries to mitigate, if not avoid, this high food price crisis, the high fuel crisis, and their challenges with debt, if we want to continue to maintain working relationships with them, with those countries, particularly when China continues to lead with an outstretched hand, to many of these countries, both from a financial standpoint as well as from a capacity development standpoint. So we need to realize we're not the only game in town that is in conversation with the leadership of countries that have historically been good partners and friends with the United States and the Western world, but they live in the reality of needing to meet the immediate needs of their own people.
Last year, I guess there were 9 million people that we lost on this planet because of hunger, because of starvation. When you look at what we are facing, this perfect storm over the next 1-2 years, do you have any assessment of what that number might look like?
Well, we saw the increases, as you've just mentioned, in the number of those who lost lives, and we've seen the increases to some 275 million who are acutely hungry now as a result of the COVID epidemic, and that number increased by 100 million people between 2000 and 2021. This crisis, if nothing is done, we could witness between 200 and 300 million additional acutely hungry people. And that's not unusual. The number of food insecure increased to 1 billion with the 2008 food crisis. And so those are not numbers taken from the air. They are numbers that reflect the populations that are what we call hotspots, potentially affected, the number of people who are in the category of vulnerable, and their lack of access to food would then total that number that I've just articulated.
Now, when I think about massive food stress in the world today, I think about Afghanistan, I think about Yemen, I think about Bangladesh. I'm wondering what you would add to that list, places we might not think about as much that are potentially going to slip hard over the next year or two.
Yeah, well, I'd start with those places like the ones that you've just listed, Afghanistan, et cetera, but also Somalia, Yemen, Northeast Nigeria, Ethiopia, places where we see very high numbers of acutely hungry today, because we know that those populations are directly dependent upon the World Food Programme's ability to access enough food to provide for the assistance that they need in order to meet their food assistance requirements, because they're in conflict. I would also include countries like Haiti, Burkina Faso, Mali, Bangladesh, and we can go through a long list, Guatemala, places where you have populations that are vulnerable because the incomes are so limited, and you don't have governments with the capacity to subsidize higher priced foods.
Earthman, you've been devoting your career to this, and I want to say, I mean, at least before we close, I want to give you a chance to talk about what you think can credibly be done by the United States. And I'm not just asking for we need to put more money. I mean, what are the programs, where are the places that we are falling down, the United States and our allies around the world, that you think a real difference can be made?
Well, of course, I must begin with the importance of ensuring that we provide the financial and food resources to the World Food Program and the other humanitarian organizations that meet the needs of those who are most vulnerable, who have no other way of accessing food. But I also think this is an opportunity for us to not build back better, but move forward better. And that is we as a global community committed to $100 billion per year for adaptation for climate as a result of the Paris Agreement. The community has yet to meet that commitment. This is an opportunity for us to begin to provide to the 500 million smallholder farmers out there the seeds, the tools, the fertilizer, as well as the technology and capacity that will allow them to increase the quality and quantity of their yields with less fertilizer and less water, but what we call the more intensive agricultural production that would give them the ability to begin to feed themselves in a much more resilient manner. And so, if we want to talk about how to address this challenge differently to ensure that the next time we are in this situation, it is a completely different context that we are addressing, we must invest in infrastructure as well as in the capacity to support the increased production by those 500 million smallholder farmers. Because remember, while we talk about a global food system, the 500 million smallholder farmers feed 80% of the people in their countries. And so if we could increase not just their productivity, but how much of that actually is received by the consumer, we can begin to address this challenge in a very different way.
Ertharin Cousin, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.